In my last video, I talked about Russia facing a shortage of manpower in the war in Ukraine because Putin has been reluctant to launch a new wave of mobilization. In this video, I want to explain why that is the case. In very broad strokes, I think we can, from a Russian sort of force structure perspective, divide the war into three phases. The first phase was from the beginning of the invasion in February last year and until September. This was the period where Putin tried to fight the war with an army that was entirely based on contract soldiers. So they did all kinds of things to get Russians to sign up for the war, but all in all, it was insufficient. So we had a period where Russia had a shortage of personnel, but they managed to compensate for that by using more firepower. So we would see images of infantry fighting vehicles pulling up somewhere and opening the doors, and out would come only one or two soldiers. But they had a huge advantage in firepower because they had much more artillery than the Ukrainians. In the long run, it didn't work. They lost a lot of their vehicles, and gradually the Russians also started to get a shortage of ammunition, especially after Ukraine got the HIMARS rocket artillery system, and they started targeting the Russian ammunition depots. So in September, after Ukraine's successful Kharkiv offensive, Putin gave the order to create a wave of partial mobilization. Supposedly, they mobilized about 300,000 men, and they also mobilized a lot of people from the Russian prisons who joined the Wagner group. So that gave the Russian army a personnel boost, and I think it's been pretty successful. At least at the time, the Ukrainians had momentum on the battlefield, and since then, the front line kind of stabilized. But then Putin decided to use these mobilized soldiers for a winter offensive. I think that was a mistake, and that's what I explained in my last video, because it gave the Russians a high level of attrition amongst those mobilized soldiers. But overall, the second phase when it comes to Russian force composition has been from around October and until now. And the theme in this phase has been that Russia has been trying to compensate for a shortage of equipment by throwing in more infantry. And this is where we get to the question of how many soldiers Russia actually has. How long will these 300,000 mobilized soldiers actually last when there is this high attrition rate? Because Putin has not launched another wave of mobilization. So there has not been a steady stream of replacements when soldiers are lost. I am always careful to mention numbers for casualties because there is a lot of uncertainty about the numbers, and usually it's not really important to the points I'm trying to make. So I just use phrases like a high or a low casualty rate or something like that, so I don't get into these discussions about numbers. But in this video, I will try to go a little bit into it just to explain why I and also many other military analysts are now talking about Russia having a shortage of manpower. One indicator for the number of Russian casualties is the numbers that are published by the Ukrainian General Staff. They come out every day with a list of how much equipment they think they have destroyed and also how many Russians they believe they have killed. And this number is usually somewhere between 500 and 1,000 dead Russians every day. For example, these are the numbers from April the 7th, and they assess that they have killed 480 Russians since the last update, and the total number of dead Russian soldiers in the war is 177,110. There are several problems with this number. First, the Ukrainians are often accused of exaggerating. I don't know if this is true, but you can see how they could have a motive, perhaps, for boosting these numbers because it makes them look successful. And the other problem is that just methodically, it's problematic to try to count enemy losses. Like many of these attacks take place over long distances because the weapons have a very long range. So you don't actually know how many people you killed with an artillery strike, for example. So you have to make an estimate, right? And I would tend to think that the Ukrainians will probably sort of be on the high side when they make those estimates. So if you think you killed maybe between 10 and 20 Russians, then you will go with 20. Like, again, it's not something that I know, because there's no way that we can verify these numbers, but it's just an uncertainty that there is about the numbers. But I think we can say that the Ukrainian number is probably like the upper ceiling. Like, we should assume that this is the highest possible number. So the highest possible number of dead Russians per day would be somewhere between 500 and 1,000. The Russians, of course, they of course know the real number, but they won't tell us. But there is a Russian media outlet called Mediazona that works together with the BBC, and they have another way of measuring the casualties. What they do is that they count the number of verified burials in Russia of soldiers that have died in Ukraine. So they will go through local media and social media and find this information. And they have some strict guidelines for the kind of documentation that is required before a burial counts. So it's a very safe number. It is only those cases where a body is brought home to a family and there is a formal burial and there is verifiable information about it online with a name of the dead person and confirmation that he did in fact serve as a soldier and die in Ukraine. And also, they don't count dead soldiers from Donetsk and Luhansk, so it's only from like Russia. So obviously, the number of burials that Mediazona finds is much smaller than the real number of dead Russian soldiers. They update the number every 2 weeks, and as I'm recording this, the latest number is from April the 7th. And there, the total number of verified Russian soldiers was 19,688. And over the previous 2 weeks, they had found 1,667 new cases. I think if we just pause here for a minute and think about that number, then it's just mind-blowing. Like, even if we imagine for a second that this is in fact the number of Russians who have lost their life in Ukraine, then it's still an absolutely enormous number. Like, if we go back to the 1980s and the Soviet war in Afghanistan, then they lost fewer than 15,000 soldiers over the course of about 10 years. And at the time, in the 1980s, that was considered a national tragedy, and it was out of a population in the Soviet Union that was about twice as big as the current Russian population. So almost 20,000 verified burials in about a year. That's just a huge number. So I think we can assume that the number from the Ukrainian General Staff is probably on the high side, and Mediazona's number is significantly below the real number. And then we have sort of Western intelligence agencies that they come out from time to time with estimates that are somewhere in between. But just to make an assessment about when Russia will have used up those 300,000 soldiers, it's not enough to count the dead persons. We also have to count in the wounded and the captured soldiers. And there is a rule of thumb that is often mentioned that for every dead soldier, then there are 3 wounded. So if we take some round numbers, and remember, this is not actually important if these numbers are a little bit off. Like, it doesn't change the point that I'm getting to if you think the real number is a little lower. But say that on average, about 500 Russian soldiers have been killed every day since the mobilization in September, when Russia also really started to have very big attrition numbers. And if we then make sort of a conservative estimate and say that for every one of these dead Russian soldiers, there have also been 2 wounded, then we get that the Russian fighting force has been decreased by about 1,500 soldiers every day. And then we can divide 300,000 by 1,500, and we get that, they have soldiers for about 200 days until the Russian army will have consumed all those mobilized soldiers. Like, this is not exact science. It's just like a rough estimate to illustrate Russia's manpower problem. And Putin actually announced the mobilization on September the 21st. And incidentally, 200 days after that is about now. It's on April the 9th, 2023. And of course, Russia is not suddenly going to run out of soldiers here in the middle of April. That's not what I'm saying. But they are getting closer to the point where they will experience that same deficit of manpower that they had back in September. And it will not be enough for them to recruit volunteers and stuff like that. They will have to find like some way of substantially increasing the size of the force. And they will have to do it quickly, because otherwise it will be a manpower-deprived Russian force that will be fighting over the summer. And in fact, Putin probably should have announced like the second wave of mobilization months ago, but he didn't do that. So that is why military analysts are talking about a Russian manpower shortage and why there is so much speculation about a new wave of mobilization. One final thing I just want to say, I am sure there will be comments asking why I didn't mention anything about Ukrainian losses in this video. And to be sure, the Ukrainian losses have also been big. But it was not the point in this video to compare the losses. Like, my point was to make an argument about how those 300,000 soldiers that Russia mobilized in the fall are probably not there anymore. Like, some of them are there, but they have lost a similar number in the same period of time. And contrary to Russia, Ukraine has continuously mobilized soldiers, so they have replaced their losses. So I don't see Ukraine running into the same kind of short-term manpower deficit. Okay, I will end it here. If you found the video helpful, please give it a like and also subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon to receive notifications when I upload new videos. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you again next time.